Hello, everyone. Hope you're all having a great day. Really fortunate today to be here with Andrew Fenning, who is the data and analyst lead with the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. Andrew, how you doing today?
How's it going? Great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you very much for being here. So, for those of us that don't know about Andrew Fanning and the Doughnut Economics Lab and donuts, like you hear donuts, I'm thinking like a breakfast snack. What? Give us some context, a little background on you, and to the concept of Doughnut Economics itself.
Great. Thanks. Sure. Well, donut economics is is this idea that was originally created by my colleague Kate Rayworth in 2012, where she was looking at this relatively new concept that's known as planetary boundaries, and which are these boundaries that are supposed to delimit the amount of pressure that we can put upon the Earth system. And this was proposed just 10 years ago by some Earth system scientists. And it's organized in like a radial plot that became very famous and very well known. And Kate saw this and said, okay, this is for sure. There's a boundary in terms of the pressure that we can put on the planet. But at the same time, there's also a lower boundary in terms of the level of resources that people need in order to meet their needs. And so she drew an inner donut, an inner ring within the planetary boundaries ring. And what it came out looking like was a donut. And actually, what she didn't invent the term, but it very, very quickly stuck. And so it became known as donut economics, which is receiving a lot of attention because people find it very useful as a way to visualize the goal almost to meet the needs of all people. So we want to make sure that all people get above a social foundation, that inner ring. So we want to get inside the donut, but without transgressing the ecological ceiling, as it's known, surpassing planetary boundaries. So we want to live within the donut.
So it was kind of
And
a donut by accident, which is
it is, and Kate always apologizes almost because it's what it came out looking like. But you can also say that it's the only donut that actually ends up being healthy for us and for our interconnected societies. So we can play with it. And actually, in terms of donut economics, one of the ways that we try to just that we try to work, that we try to engage, that we try to interact with others is through a very open and light and playful approach. Because obviously, a donut is, when you think about it, a ridiculous vision for thriving in the 21st century, which is what it actually measures. So that's where we are. And I come into the scene, I call myself an ecological economist. I It's a field that I discovered actually about 10 years ago when I was doing my master's at Dalhousie University, which is in the city I'm from, Halifax in Canada. And I was doing a master's in economics, and I actually wanted to take a course in environmental economics, but there I quickly discovered that at the grad level, there were no environmental economics courses that semester that year. So I started looking around and I found this course called Economics for Resource and Environmental Management in a management studies program. And it ended up being a course in this field called ecological economics. And to me, I had 6 years of formal training in departments of economics. So I walked into this class and it just was a decision that changed the course of my life, because it was not just the economics that I had been learning. It was history of economic thought. It was feminist economics, it was complexity economics, and of course, uh, ecological consideration. So I learned this course and it was wonderful, the new ideas, but at the core, it was really very, very critical of what I became known for the first time. What I heard was mainstream economics or neoclassical economics. And the main critique of this school was just the structural inability to address the climate and ecological crises that we're facing. And the main criticism was around this idea of scale. Like, how big can an economy get? How big is it now? And how big should it be? And if you're taking Department of Economics classes, typically these are questions that don't get very much attention because growth in economics is typically seen as a good thing. It's just we want more growth. That's the way that we can rise people out of poverty. And what this course questioned was, at what point does growth become not such a good thing? Because of course everything grows up to a point, but then you grow up, and the question becomes is when, if our economies, where is that point and how do we reach it? And so that's how I came in. And I became very, very, very interested in the ideas, started reading, started asking more questions, which then, of course, led me to the ideas of donut economics, which are intimately related to all of that.
That's fascinating. And I always hear some of these big companies talking about what are our growth projections, and they have a 10% growth projection and then they only get 7%, and it's like the world is on fire and everything is gone terrible. But I'm still thinking, man, like, man, they still grew. They've grown every single year for 25 years, 5, 10% every year. And you brought up the good point of within growth, as oftentimes is perceived to be good, there's that concept of how big can it get, but to the donut economics perspective of how big should it get based on these planetary boundaries, based on the social capital and the social services that should be provided. So it seems like there's this balance that we're kind of like in limbo. We're almost like you want to move forward, but not too fast, but we can't go too far back because we need to provide enough so people aren't living in poverty. So it's this balance. But then there's also this public perception that we must grow, grow, grow. So it's like where do we start? Like what are some of these tools and philosophies that are ingrained within donut economics that you can share with us?
That's a great question. Can I share my screen?
Yes, please.
It's could be a useful way to do it this way. Okay, can you see that?
Yep,
All right.
perfect.
Okay, so if we think about donut economics, I just mentioned Dalhousie University. This is my home city. Um, but to get straight to your question, where we begin is almost with what we have inherited, which is the 20th century economic system that we believe is in urgent need of transformation. So if we think of a starting point, what are you taught the very first class? For those of you who have taken an intro to economics class, supply and demand, right? Like
Classic.
where the starting point of analysis is this idea of equilibrium as measured by price. So price becomes the yardstick of value, and anything that can't be marketized. Uh, I don't think that's a word, but
Commercialized,
traded in a
marketized.
market. Um, yeah, it's that obviously gets left out of what gets valued. And then we move to the self-portrait. What does 20th century economics, what type of person shows up in this school of thought? Well, the idea is that it's always a man, Homo economicus, he's known as, with money in his hand, ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and the natural world at his feet. And the goal, when we think of the economy, is just what we were talking about, right? Never ending growth in gross domestic product, in GDP, no matter how rich a city or a nation is, because our economic system, it's more than just wanting growth. We are dependent and we expect growth. That's how our economic system is structured. It's fundamentally dependent upon it. And that's what needs to be recognized and then designed out. And so this is the mindset that we've received, and it's actually been fueling, I believe, many of the crises that we're actually facing. So in the 21st century, we're dealing with a financial meltdown in 2008. Is take a step back, right? Of course, we're in the COVID lockdown, but the 21st century itself has begun with a series of global recurring shocks from the financial meltdown, as I just mentioned, climate and ecological breakdown, as well as this unprecedented COVID lockdown that we're all enduring. And the impacts of these crises are being felt disproportionately, by age, by gender, by wealth, in the global north and in the global south. And what they're telling us is that we're fundamentally connected with one another as well as with the living world, and that these crises are hugely disruptive to our well-being. And so in order to move beyond them, we need to think of a new vision and a new idea for prosperity. So that's where we come in. We offer a donut. And this is it, where you can think of it as a compass for the 21st century, where, as I mentioned before, we want to make sure that we are above the social foundation, but below the ecological ceiling. So the social foundation are these various social dimensions like food, water, health, education, political voice, gender equality. These social priorities have actually been crowdsourced from the Sustainable Development Goals. And so they've been agreed upon by all the world's governments. But so we want to make sure everyone gets into the green space of the donut, but without crossing into the area of the planetary boundaries that I mentioned. Like we cause climate change, we acidify the oceans, we cause critical biodiversity loss and other environmental impacts. So this is the donut, this is where we want to be. And if we can operate within this safe and just space for humanity, then I'm convinced that we can thrive with well-being, as you were mentioning before. We don't necessarily need additional growth. We can grow up, so to speak. But of course, if this is the goal, then we know that we are far, far from achieving it, because today billions of people are not meeting their most essential needs, as well as collectively, we're overstepping multiple planetary boundaries, like climate change, like nitrogen and phosphorus loading, like land conversion and critical biodiversity loss. So these red wedges, like for example, for food, that's actually showing that at a global level, where 11% of the world is hungry. So that red wedge goes down 11% from the social foundation, etc. And similarly for the ecological overshoot wedges. So this is where we are. This is the state of humanity and our planetary home. As Kate calls it, it's our selfie. And it's just a vision of where we are in the 21st century. And we believe that it doesn't make sense to expect 20th century economics to be able to address this challenge, because they never had to deal with that. That's not what it was designed to do. So that's why in the 21st century, we need new policies and new theories and new strategies in order to bring ourselves back within planetary boundaries and achieving human needs for the first time.
And Andrew,
And
I
once
think
we see
that's
this,
a big point just to think about. Like you mentioned 20th century or even 18th and 19th century economists from I think about whether it's Adam Smith and free market economics and laissez-faire, kind of just let the market figure itself out. And to an extent, some bubbles that's maybe okay, but I I think now we're venturing a point where that sort of status quo, what got us to where we are now, is not what is not sustainable. And I think, but one of the problems I think is this perception of that standard growth chart you showed, just timing GDP. That's what we need to do. What do you two questions? What do you think like an 18th century Adam Smith free market economist would say to you in your conversation today, and what are some how do we change this perception that what we've done in the past is not what we can continue to do tomorrow?
hmm, that's great. I'm not sure. I'd love to have a coffee with Adam Smith or with Karl Marx or John Stuart Mill or John Maynard Keynes, or the economists who always seem to be men, by the way, until the more recent generation. Actually, right now, some of the most inspiring economists for me are female economists, including Kate Raworth, who I get to spend a lot of time with, but also Mariana Mazzucato. Um, lots and lots. Yeah. But to answer your question, what would I say? I don't think that there's much to say. For example, at least John Stuart Mill was a classical economist who very much recognized this idea of that eventually there's a need to grow up. So they were working and living at a time very much in line of colonial expansion, with obviously from a European perspective, that was a time of bounty and plenty, but in the lands that were being colonized, there's a different perspective. But John Stuart Mill, for example, fully recognized that that it would be great to live in a world that wasn't going towards endless growth, and that it would actually provide more time to enjoy the important things in life. I can't remember the exact quote. He has a wonderful one that I need to stick it to my wall in front of me so that I can quote it. But if you recall John Stuart Mill and the idea of a stationary state economy, he wrote about it beautifully. And so I don't think I would need to say much to those economists because they recognized that that period would one day arrive. They knew that we were on a finite planet, but they weren't living at a time where there are 7.5 billion of us, with the scale of the economic activity being how much bigger today is it compared to when they were living? I would say at least 30 to 100 times more. So I don't think that they would be surprised.
Yep.
But to your second point, what can we do about this now that we're here, rather than wishing that we could have coffee with John Stuart Mill, is I think the first step is just to see this image for what it is. It's honestly, it's what keeps me up at night almost, is if you once you've seen this image and this challenge, you can't just unsee it. It's that I have young children. I strongly believe that my children's children will look at this and they'll ask me as a grandparent, what did you do when you saw this? What, like, how could you, how, yeah,
Yeah.
how did you react? What could you do? So I think the first step is seeing this. And then the next step is recognizing that we can just redesign. All of these are social constructs that can be redesigned through tools and policies and strategies.
That's a good point.
And ah, and
Yeah,
I
like
wanted to bring up a key point here, though, is that I've been speaking here with the global donut is this concept of humanity, right? I said that we're collectively overshooting planetary boundaries. But of course, the the responsibility for overshooting those planetary boundaries is highly unequal. And the capacity in terms of reaching the social foundation is also highly unequal. And both of those have interconnected histories, as well as power relations. So I was involved in a study where we looked at, different nations in terms of the donut. And if you take a look at just a few of them, you can see here Malawi on the left with an economic activity equivalent to just $1,000 per person. You can see that they're massively falling short on the social foundation, right? There's a long way to go in order to achieve people's most basic needs in Malawi. But at the same time, they're not overshooting fair shares of planetary boundaries. So people in Malawi are living well within their impact, their fair share of planetary boundaries. Then you can look at China, who's similar to what we see at the global level, like partly beyond and also not within for social foundation. And then you can look at the United States, for example, where in terms of social performance, performing relatively well, at least based on this international standard, although you can see that there's even in that regard, of course, the United States has work to do, especially in terms of equality. But just looking at the ecological impact of the average US standard of living, there's just no way that that could be sustainably extended to all people on the planet. Um, and by the way, for many high income nations, we see the same big red overshoot wedges. And so if we take just, well, now if we look at actually all the countries that were involved in this study, we can see here we want humanity to be in the top left-hand corner where the donut is, where we're meeting the needs of all without transgressing any planetary boundaries. And what this chart shows is that there's no country that can just, put up its hand and say, I'm there, I'm living sustainably. Uh, so this really opens up a question of our previous development pathways. And just to say, there's no country that, for example, that could call itself developed and developing. At Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we never use the terms developed and developing anymore, actually, because from the perspective of the donut, all countries are developing because no one's there yet. But of course, we have different pathways to get there.
I'm just curious, what is it about, I see Vietnam is maybe the quote unquote one of the best positioned on this chart,
Hmm.
closest to the donut. Is there
Yeah.
anything in particular that Vietnam is doing that's noteworthy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've of course wondered that as soon as we saw this result, it surprised us to see Vietnam jump out like that because typically the 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 more common country like that would be seen as a sustainability hero is like Costa Rica or other nations. But Vietnam, a lot of this data is from the year 2011, and I think a certain aspect of the environmental performance is almost a coincidence in terms of they were reaching a point with very almost a takeoff period, similar to China in the early 1990s, except just at a later point.
Mhm.
So to answer the question, we've since looked in detail at the pathway that Vietnam is following, and in terms of a trajectory, it's unfortunately not moving towards the donut. It's more shooting up to that top right hand corner as well.
Mhm.
Um,
Okay.
But if we think about the different trajectories that nations can follow to get into the donut, I think it's worth differentiating them, right? Like we can think of our low income countries like Malawi who need to increase human well-being while keeping their environmental pressure within planetary boundaries, which has never been done, right? Like it's every country before them has pursued well-being while overshooting planetary boundaries. So what would that pathway look like in order to get into the donut? And we can also think of the emerging or middle income countries that need to get within planetary boundaries and meet their human needs for the first time. Then what does that pathway look like, right? Again, there's new policies, new theories. We need a new vision in order to avoid or leapfrog the mistakes of the high income nations, because these countries as well just need to maintain or improve human well-being indeed, but at the same time massively reduce their environmental burden or their pressure on the planet. So this is why we say that there's no country that can be seen as developed. We all have work to do, although in different ways. And of course, we're not just like bubbles on a chart either. Like we are actually deeply interconnected, as I mentioned earlier, through history, through power, through a history of colonialism and military power, through structural adjustment programs in the 1980s, where low-income countries were kind of opened up to exports and current stories of debt and trade rules, which are disproportionately, just balanced in term, well, disproportionately benefit the wealthy on a global stage. There's current stories, of course, of resource extraction and land grabs by multinational corporations, as well as enabled through foreign direct investment, and of course, climate change impacts, which
Yeah.
have disproportionately been caused by the wealthy nations, but are being felt first and hardest by the nations.
And I want to just to make emphasize this point where we're also learning about sense making, which is really providing context behind the situations that exist today. And then thinking about those points you have on here, like what is the impact of colonialism on Vietnam, on Malaysia, on Australia, on Malawi, on Philippines? I mean, thinking about who colonized them, at what point, for what time, and then how that led to the development of systems and resource extraction and trade partnerships. Those all play into where we are today. And I think it's very important to take a look back at history with a fine-tuned lens to look at where
Mhm.
we are today. And then also you hear that phrase, history repeats itself. How do we learn from mistakes so we don't repeat the unfortunate failures that humans have made over time?
Yes, yes, that's great. And that's exactly what we see because, and I think there's a strong tendency to view it's just part of the almost the international development discourse, this idea of developed countries, developing countries. We see nations as a unit of analysis and just seeing them in this way. That's why I think it's so important to make these points because I'm showing it in that viewpoint, right? Like as if they're bubbles on isolated bubbles on a screen. but actually they're not. And looking at those interconnections are, of course, where so much of the richness lies. And this is actually ties in really nicely to the work that we're doing now. This is almost an academic exercise, like a global snapshot across nation. But what we're working on now is much more at the city level, and is starting to look at, okay, so we know where we want to be and we know where we are. What are the context specific dynamics that can take us from here to there? And that question, of course, doesn't lend itself very well to a simple scatter plot like this, because you start seeing it just turns into a spaghetti plot.
Hmm.
Um, but that's very much the work that we're doing now, is asking ourselves this question, right? So we've now entered this era of unprecedented transformation. What will be your nation's journey? And to think about the dynamics at least a little bit, we think of these two major high level dynamics. The first one is recognizing that the 20th century was characterized by degenerative dynamics. Is the idea of take, make, use, and lose. It's a very linear, extractive, and exploitative process that was celebrated in the 20th century. But of course, we're witnessing the impacts of that linear model here today in the 21st century. So what we need to do now is, of course, to bend those curves around and recognize that what we need are regenerative dynamics. So to regenerate as much as we can in terms of biological materials, restoring technical materials, and these ideas, they're not new. They form the basis of what's known as the circular economy. Um, but at the same time, we also need to recognize that in the 20th century, it was highly centralizing, right? Where the power and authority and value was concentrated and is becoming ever more concentrated in the hands, witnessing a rise of a global 1% or a global 0.01% or what have you. And what we need to do is transform that centralizing dynamic into a much more distributive one, where the value that's created is shared much more equally among all who co-create it. And so these are the two big dynamics that we see if we're thinking about that bubble chart. I want to be here. Here's where I am. How do I get there? Well, at a high level, we need to be much more regenerative and much more distributive. And we can think of examples of that like all over the world. For example, rapid transit in Curitiba in the 1970s. And this are just some illustrative examples. I'm sure you could find many, many more. But just making investments at a city level to make it so that this particular mode of transit is much more attractive for people to take. And it's been highly, copied worldwide since then. Not, of course, the only ones who invented it, but just as an example. We can think of cycling in Paris, where again, if we want to work towards displacing the private car, how can we do it? You can literally just, and we saw this with the COVID-19 outbreak, you can just repaint lines on the road, and you actually can just redesign the city and make visible just the new economy that's just waiting to become the mainstream. And just this Rue de Rivoli in Paris is a wonderful example. It's just, I think there's a video from 2009 comparing 2019 or something. In 2009, it's just vehicle, one biker. And today it's just a highway of cyclists. So just how can we make visible what's already just waiting to burst forth? We can think of circular building. This is an example from Amsterdam where you can see that it's mostly renewable materials. And in terms of the connections and the attachments, they're generally just clipped or snapped or bolted into place, so that as things wear out or as this building runs to the end of its life, we can unbolt and unclip and unsnap and reuse these materials for other purposes. So again, circular construction being a key part. And finally, you can think of the design of a city itself. Like in many cities, at least in the 20th century, rivers running through the city were seen as kind of like a waste stream for the effluence of the city. But how can you redesign it to reclaim that space and clean up the city and provide not just a cleaner river, but of course a green and nice area for the city's residents.
Yep.
And So yeah,
And one
there's
with it,
a few
if you,
examples.
one
Yeah.
other with the regenerative by design, and maybe this is distributed by design question too, but it seems like there's a lot on transit and architecture, and then I like kind of the improving city centers like you show here with river parks and Meadowline. But I always hear that agriculture is one of the largest users of water and just resources in general. And people always ask me, what is one thing that I could do to be a better global steward? And one of the best examples is to reduce or eliminate your meat consumption, just looking at how much of a carbon and climate impact meat consumption has. But agriculture in general, and maybe this is a talk all on its own, but what is some of the donut economics theory with agriculture? Because I know a theory I also think quite a lot about is the whole Thomas Malthusian theory, just looking at the concept of we have a growing population and we finite resources. We actually only have so many resources that can be used, and one of the most important ones is the food that we consume. So
Mm.
with that regenerative by design or distributive by design, and maybe we're going to get to this, but what's some context on the agricultural perspective from a donut lens?
That's a great question. A couple things come to mind. One of them is this concept of regenerative agriculture, right? Like this is again a whole field in and of itself. But one of the slogans in it, which is really interesting to me, and there's a recent documentary that's narrated by Woody Harrelson. It's on Netflix called Kiss the Ground.
Mhm.
And actually, if one of the slogans within regenerative agriculture and permaculture and that way of performing agriculture is to recognize that it's not the cow, it's the how. Is the idea is that we need to be much more conscious of where the real problem lies. And I would argue that it's much more in the industrial model of agriculture, the large scale, very linear, high inputs in terms of nutrients and massification and intensification of resources, which then of course have massive waste outflows as well. So it's yeah, I think it's clear from my response there. One
Yeah.
of our partners is actually working in Costa Rica, who's with an initiative called Regenerate Costa Rica, and they're very much they're doing almost exactly where your question is, except in practice, is taking how can we take the ideas of donut economics as an overall framing for our regenerative agriculture projects. And yeah, so that's one thing. The other thing was actually when you mentioned Malthus, there's a really interesting book by a guy named Yorgos Kallis called Limits, and he actually dives into the Malthusian theory and realized that actually Malthus was he didn't so much invent the idea of limits, he actually invented the idea of scarcity. Because to Malthus, he believed he was one of the first ones. The very first chair in economics actually was Reverend Dr. Thomas Malthus. And he was most responsible for the idea that human beings have unlimited wants. And and that's a key part of the Malthusian principle, right? Is that we have unlimited wants, but we only have limited resources. And because of that, we are forced to make choices. And this is the fundamental principle of neoclassical economics. But if you actually start to question it, like, do we have unlimited wants? Maybe we do. Or maybe my society has just fashioned me in such a sense that I've been trained and brought up to believe that I have unlimited wants. Because you can look to other societies that have been functioning really quite well within a set of limits. If you look towards indigenous societies in Australia or in the United States or et cetera, et cetera. So it's just a really interesting history there around Malthus and what he was responsible for doing. I would argue that it's more the idea of scarcity than the idea of limits.
Yeah, well said. And I think that person you brought that up earlier, but that societal norms for unlimited wants. Maybe it is, in fact, that we just need to realize that we we just kind of need to reshape what our wants and needs are, and it is okay to work hard to obtain certain things, but it is still just that that balance of how much do you really need based on what you really are capable of owning and extracting based on these boundaries that exist. So that was really helpful context. So thank you for that.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Um, I'd like to run through a few examples of
Please,
distributed by design, if that's helpful.
very much so.
Cool. So we remember that distributed by design is the idea to move from a centralizing to a much more distributed network. And of course, there's so many ways of doing that. It goes back decades, if not centuries of thinking. So a few examples. One is Community Enterprise in Preston. And this is a city in the, not a very rich, or it's a post-industrial city in the north of England, which has been actually gained a lot of attention on the world stage for transforming their procurement practices of what they call anchor institutions. So this is the schools, universities, hospitals, like those institutions that aren't going anywhere. They approached the, well, some, yeah, they approached these different institutions with this idea of how can we make your procurement so that you are able to contract a lot more people locally, create good paying local jobs, etc. I think in Cleveland, Ohio is another real um, home base of this idea of community wealth building, as it's called. And it's centered around how can procurement practices, how can your contracts be redesigned so that they can revitalize the local community within which you're embedded, as opposed to being, siphoned off for some multinationals with their home bases in Cayman Islands or something.
It's a great
Uh,
example of the policy decisions on procurement and how by changing that and how you can move towards that distributed by design of making the opportunity, keeping the opportunities in the supply chain within the local environment, just by changing how procurement is done.
yeah,
Wow, it's really
yeah,
cool.
yeah. So, I mean, one of the ideas that you can use for that is almost, oh, there's so many different types of examples, but essentially there, a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises face hurdles when competing for tenders, right? So, and those who control the procurement process can redesign it so that you can say, hey, are you a small and medium-sized enterprise? Then you get 10 points. Are you like operating within the community? Then you get blah. Do you have this many employees? Then. So there's ways of being creative to do so, and it's actually really empowering. And the numbers in Preston in particular, just the difference in terms of the local procurement went from, I think the numbers are like 10%, and 5 years later it was like 40% in terms of several, I think at the city level. So there's some really, really interesting work in that respect.
Good
Another
stuff.
example is this idea of affordable housing, which to me is just fascinating, because of course we all need a place to live, but the policies and the subsidies around how people live and where people live have huge variation. So I was really, really surprised to learn that in Vienna, 2/3 of households are either in social housing or with public subsidies. And it makes it so that Vienna is consistently being ranked as one of the most livable cities in the world, because social housing is not seen as it doesn't have a negative stereotype or anything associated with it, because in fact, the majority of people have that, are living in that type of housing. But you can contrast that with another V city, for example, Vancouver, which is a city that is experiencing a really, really giant housing bubble, which is facilitated by a lot of investors, a lot of people who are viewing real estate as an investment as opposed to, a place where people live. And the city, in this case, has mechanisms in which that they can make it more distributive or less distributive. I think it's a really interesting contrast between the two. We can think of the living wage this is actually hugely relevant right now, of course, with the recent bill passed in the United States, this idea of a $15 minimum wage, and that people have enough to live with their working full time. Seems like I won't say much more about that, but we can also think of almost at the interface of regenerative and distributive by design. This is a public space in Bogota, which you can see is just being, it's a parking lot. But how can the city reclaim this space and redesign it so that it can be used for a place to be for meeting, a place for kids to play, a park, etc. So how can we take, you know, how can we live in a place that has like private sufficiency but public luxury, as George Monbiot claimed,
Can you say
as
that one more
George
time?
Monbiot has.
Private sufficiency
So yeah, so
and public.
how can we live in such a way that we have enough as individuals, but we live in a space communally, in common, like collectively, or in the public domain where we have luxury. And it's just a flip in terms of mentality of, again, the degree that neoliberal economics and the concept of the individual operating in a market-based environment compared to a collective operating in not just the market, but also the commons, also the state, also the households, and recognizing that we have many economic identities and that their interactions, oftentimes we just flip between a market-based persona to a state-based persona to a household-based persona to a commons-based, even without even noticing. It's just a regular feature of our lives.
Yeah.
And yet our economics only captures this one slice of economic reality.
So beautifully said.
Cool. So we're going here. So right now we've talked about the donut, right, which shows the goal.
Hmm.
We've measured where we are with respect to the goal at the global level. We've looked at it at the national level. We've talked about the regenerative dynamics and distributive dynamics. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that we start getting into how can we take these high-level concepts and high-level ideas and apply them to a particular context. And we start by asking this very 21st century question. We invite ambitious cities to ask it, which in this case for Chicago, that says, how can Chicago be a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? So that's a relatively complicated question that you can see is actually within it is 4 questions. So the first one is, what would it mean for the people of Chicago to thrive? Right. So if we think of the aspirations of what it means to live well in Chicago, there could be many, many different answers to that. But the
Yeah.
key thing for me is, of course, that whoever answers it, I think that it should be the people of Chicago who are best placed to provide an answer. And you could do it by looking at the stated goals of the city. You could do it by doing surveys or citizens assemblies or many, many different ways to get a feel for that. But the key being that what it means to live well in Chicago doesn't have to be the same as what it means to live well in Copenhagen. Like it can be, local aspirations can differ across spaces. Then we can ask, what would it mean for Chicago to thrive within its natural habitat, right? So where on this planet is Chicago and what type of ecosystem is it embedded within? So if Chicago wasn't there, what type of services and things would nature be providing in this place? And can we use, not to say to get rid of Chicago at all, but can we recognize that aspiration of what nature would be doing and use that in the design of our city? So think of the city, the forest next door, like how much carbon does it sequester, or how much groundwater does it store, or how much biodiversity does it house? And can we go to that place and actually measure those things? You can do it, and then come back to the city and say, okay, here's what nature would be doing if Chicago was, well, a healthy ecosystem next door is doing these things. Can we redesign Chicago so that it also sequesters as much carbon or stores as much groundwater or houses as much biodiversity? And how can we use this concept of biomimicry, as it's called, as a means to, um, well, just as an aspiration for the design of our own cities? So I guess these 2 questions lay out the local aspirations. But of course, every place needs to recognize that it's part of a bigger whole. takes place in a broader context. So the next bits are the global responsibility. So how can Chicago respect the health of the whole planet? So if we think of all of the goods, the food, the clothing, the electronics, the construction materials that are flowing through the city, and think of the environmental burdens associated with those, no matter where they occur in the world. And you can say, how much materials went into these? What is the upstream emissions or the waste flows associated with those? And just account for that within the consumption of the people of Chicago and ask if everybody consumed like this, would we be respecting the health of the planet? And as we saw for the broader United States, the answer to that in virtually all high income places is a big fat no. And so then we can think, how can we change this? But of course, don't just think of the ecological. We also need to think, how can Chicago respect the well-being of people worldwide? So again, we can think of the food and the clothing and the electronics and the construction materials, except instead of thinking of the resources, now we think of the people who are growing the food and stitching the clothes and assembling the electronics and distributing and shipping and all of the supply chains that are linking Chicago to the rest of the world, and ask what are the working conditions within those supply chains and how are they affecting their communities, for example. And of course, you can also recognize that there are many, many global social interconnections between Chicago. They're not just bad. For example, like child slavery in chocolate supply chains, they can also be, foreign exchange students or remittances or just many, many different interconnections that can be explored. So
Th-
this is the
and I
question
thank
that
you
we
for.
invite.
Sorry,
Huh?
go on. Sorry about that.
No, no, no. This is just the questions that we invite ambitious 21st century cities to ask themselves, and recognizes that they're complex and they're deep and they're not easy. And typically, most cities stay in the top two pieces of this matrix, right? In the local aspect. And when you start thinking about the global, it starts getting deeper and heavier. But of course, just ignoring these questions doesn't make them go away. So this is where we go back to seeing where we stand, humanity's selfie. And and actually, when you carry out these activities with this is workshops in Philadelphia and Portland in September of 2019, as you can tell by how close everyone is,
Yeah,
because in it seems like a lifetime
such a
ago.
foreign world.
Yeah. But actually, the process of asking those questions and creating what we call these city portraits um, was actually really empowering, because you bring city planners and city stakeholders and together. And the nice thing is each person can see themselves within this broader whole. So if you bring teachers, you can bring ecologists, you can bring people who are concerned about trade, you can bring just every different uh, sector of the city is represented in some way. But at the same time, you also get a holistic snapshot of the whole, so that you can see that you're a part of something bigger. And
I like
so
that.
that's the work that we're doing now.
So
And
yeah, and I think just the important part here when considering everything that we've learned today, and as you continue to approach anything in the world, is to have that interdisciplinary lens, and knowing that there is an economic perspective, ecological perspective, a political perspective, a historical perspective, and we need multiple viewpoints at the table. We need diversity at the table. We need different, men, females, all different types of ethnicities at the table with different perspectives. Because when you just have one or two of the same people making all decisions, you're leaving out many of the important viewpoints on what actually the city looks like and what actually the problems are. And to your one comment I was to make earlier when thinking about capitalism and growth is that not I think it's important to know within the donuts that not all growth is bad. Not all capitalism is bad. It's just some types of capitalistic tendencies are very old school and degenerative and single-minded focused on GDP. And that's where I like the covering this all, because it's just important to recognize, and then I think pulls into here of all these theories and of all these things we talked about. This is great, and I've got the book here next to me, and I reference it often, but how do I take this book and really, and as you mentioned in our past call, downscale it and make it something that is applicable and attainable. And I know Amsterdam, of course, is it's on the screen right now. So maybe Amsterdam is a good example of how to actually really put all this discussion into practice.
Yeah, I mean, and it gets at what I was just talking about. Essentially, in Amsterdam, Portland, and Philadelphia, we asked those cities, we invited them to consider that question that I showed. It shows local aspirations, global responsibilities. We constructed what's called a portrait, which are these here. So if you imagine in the photo in the top left-hand corner, you can see that they're all pointing uh, at a document with 4 green circles on it, right? So those are actually correspond to those 4 questions that I asked. So for each of those, what we did was find local targets for the social perspective, for example, local targets, and map that to local performance. So we say, what are your aspirations? How are you performing socially? What are your aspirations ecologically based on biomimicry? And how are you performing? Again, local ecologically. For the respecting the health of the planet, that's where the planetary boundaries really come in, where your targets are we want to stay within planetary boundaries. And you can look at performance in terms of what are called environmental footprints, or recognizing the consumption-based environmental burdens of your the flows through the city.
Hmm.
And similarly for the global social, that one is how can we respect the well-being of all people? That one actually quantitatively is the most difficult because of course there are so many interconnections between it. But what we did was we looked at the essentially the main brands that were on sale, because we could actually recognize, okay, we're going to look at supply chains of food, clothing, and electronics. And we can look at the brands that are being sold in each of these cities because we live in a world of giant multinational corporations. And we can say that the the city isn't responsible for these supply chains, but these goods are on sale within the city, so that there is an interconnection between the residents of the city, as well as if you look at food. Uh, well, take an example. Yeah, actually, in Amsterdam, it came out. It was quite surprising that it's a very big port, and it's actually the Europe's largest importer of cocoa. And most cocoa in Europe comes from West Africa that have been clearly documented links between child slavery and really some very difficult working conditions, both for the workers as well as the communities. And so when you show that to someone in Amsterdam and say, hey, actually this chocolate that you're eating is associated with child slavery, then um, Kate has a really, really interesting story, because when they showed this portrait to the city the first time, it was the global social lens that was actually the most difficult one, because if you're concerned with making the city green and making sure that people have great education and great healthcare, and then you show them saying, well, actually, your city is also associated with child slavery, then the city planners were just like, whoa, like, take that out. I don't want to see that, actually. And it took some, yeah, not persuading, but it took some arguing to recognize that this too is a reality of your city. And the way that it was done, actually, if you read the Amsterdam City Donut report, it's that it was by pointing to the organizations and the social enterprises and the NGOs who were at work in the city, working towards a better world that makes trade fair, and that recognizes these global interconnections, like Fairphone, like Tony's Chocolonely, like various brands who are trying to be progressive and address these very concerns. So we could point to them and say, well, it's clearly a problem because your city is actually one of the most progressive in this space. And that was a way to make it more, just a more real experience of
Hmm.
what it means to live in this city
Well, I think
and
it's
have that make sense.
good to acknowledge that a lot of times we only want to highlight the good and the really nice photos and all the positives, but every city and even every individual has some sort of dark side or has something that maybe they aren't proud of, and we want to aspire to continue to be as good as we can be. But I think another aspect of what you talked about there was it seemed like a big communication play of how do you
Yeah.
phrase something as it to show this is what your stakeholder wants and this is what you're doing and this is ultimately moving towards this aspirational donut goal, which is finding that win-win-win. But how do we communicate in a way that it's not like, hey, you have to go backwards and do nothing. It's, hey, this is actually an opportunity for all of us to grow in a responsible way, for all of us to grow in a way that meets the needs as well as is um, attractive to everyone. And it's not
Mm.
like you have to stop and do nothing and that we're kind of putting all these regulations on you. But it's seems to me this there's a huge communication element to this, and you accomplished that with Amsterdam. But I'd love to know your thoughts on other communication strategies that exist or examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind with what you just mentioned there, and it's a key criteria of this portrait approach, is just to recognize that each of these dimensions is important. So for the social, we recognize, food, water, health, social equity, equality and diversity, gender equality, et cetera, et cetera. So there's dimensions that are important, and same for local ecological, same for the planetary boundaries, same for the global social, and that oftentimes this portrait approach, just by recognizing that we need to have a target as well as a measure of performance, was something that the city hadn't approached their own data gathering and their statistics for. So what they ended up having was quite a few blanks in the targets, for example, like for the social performance at the city level, all kinds of targets. We know we want to have well-educated people with jobs, income, mobility, you name it. But when you start moving into the other dimensions of the portrait, you started finding less and less targets. And we very much believe that highlighting those lack of targets is just as important as recognizing the targets that were there. And so we just left them blank. It was just said, well, these are based on the sustainable development goals for the social, respecting the well-being of all people. But actually at the city level, you have no targets related to, how, I think you get the point.
Yeah.
So that's that was, I think, a very powerful piece of this approach. That one, as well as recognizing that the whole exercise is not meant to be like a comprehensive data collection exercise. It's meant to be holistic. So in the cases where there's lots of data, we didn't want to show 15 indicators and 15 targets for each thing. We just chose one as a tool for opening up a discussion so that you can say, okay, this is the one we chose. Is this right? So if we think of housing, for example, the dimension of housing can be, you could think of a lot of different indicators that could measure our performance with respect to housing. You could think of homeless people on the streets. You could think of, affordability, uh, etc. So each one of those dimensions has their own questions around what gets shown.
Yep. Well said. So other I'm not sure what else left in the the PowerPoint, but you've given a lot of good context. But one thing that I'm very interested in hearing is you gave some good examples of cities and some city examples from Philadelphia, Portland, Amsterdam, and some of those other examples within the distributive and regenerative by design. But what about businesses in as a focus? I mean, when thinking of we talked a little bit about agriculture earlier, but from a I don't even know, like from a technology company, from a manufacturing company, from a software as a service company, from the flower delivery company to a company that makes their company we're talking to is they make toys out of recycled plastics. I mean, there's so many types of business, and they all how what are some different strategies from taking a donut economic lens and looking at it? How do you even go about doing that from a business standpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Doughnut Economics Action Lab, it's working right now. We've organized our work across 5 big themes. One of them, which I've mostly been speaking about here today, is around cities and places and government and policy. But we have a whole other theme on business and enterprise, on communities and art, and on education and research. And the business and enterprise one is actually, I guess the way that we work is we recognize that there's a need for transformative action this decade, right? So that if we're gonna well have a chance of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees and the various indicators that are shown in the donut that we need to hit, it has to happen now and it has to happen fast. And one of the ways that we work towards that is the power of peer-to-peer inspiration. So what we do is we demonstrate a proof of concept. So for example, this work in Amsterdam that we've been talking about, we develop a methodology, demonstrate the proof of concept, and then make the methodology freely available to everyone on our platform or everyone who wants to use it, right? So all of our tools and our guides become Creative Commons open access so that you can take it, you can adapt it, you can innovate with it. All we ask is that you share back so that we can build upon these innovations as they start moving forward. And now this is the work in Amsterdam, which then we followed up with this methodological guide. In the field of business, we take this very, and I should just say, this is the type of inspiration that that we're seeing as a result of the pioneer, a mayor who inspires another mayor, or a business leader who inspires another business leader, or a teacher who inspires a teacher, or et cetera, et cetera. What we see is that this power of peer-to-peer inspiration is much stronger than me giving a lecture or anything like that. It's demonstrating it working in action. So making those tools open. At the same time, we need to safeguard the integrity of the ideas, right? And the ideas are really quite radical in the terms that we need to dramatically reduce resource use in especially in high income and wealthy nations. So, but it's very visual and it's very compelling. So we're receiving a lot of interest from business, and we, especially from mainstream business, business as usual business. And so it becomes a question where we're being quite careful because Kate has a wonderful line where it's, when a disruptive and transformative idea meets business as usual, one of those things are going to get transformed. And our job is to make sure that it's not us. And so what we've done is we've set up some very clear and pretty strict conditions around how businesses can engage with the core ideas of the donut. And the first one is that we're asking for now for any businesses to not use the donut publicly in their communications, in their websites, in their presentations, because we see there's such a high risk of just greenwashing and co-opting the ideas that are at the core. That being said, we very much encourage businesses and enterprises internally to use the donut as a tool for exploring the types of dynamics that we've been talking about, regenerative, distributive, but oftentimes it's not through the lens of their products, which is how many businesses want to approach it and say, I think you mentioned like recycled content toys or whatever. It's actually through the design of the institutions of the businesses themselves. And this is actually where we get into this final tool that I'll talk about here today, which is the idea of how can we could think of this for a city or for an enterprise or whatever. If we look at the 20th century, the idea was how can we make our business or our city grow? And what we want to have is how can we make our growing city or our growing business thrive? And we argue that there are these 5 core design traits that each city or business or institution can ask itself and see whether it's aligned with serving a growth city or serving a thriving city. And the first one is around the idea of purpose. So in Amsterdam, they had a really clear purpose where they want to be a thriving, inclusive, regenerative city for all residents while respecting the planetary boundaries. So that's like, it's got donut written all over it. It's great. But of course, that's just the first step. And this is where climate declarations come in. It all sounds really nice, but then you'd go a layer deeper. What about the networks? And here we can talk about your anchor institutions, your procurement strategies. How can you redesign your networks so that you're more aligned with the goals of the donut? And recognize when your networks are not aligned with the donut as well. So you can talk about long-term contracts, multi-city procurement, for example. These are stories from various cities. One in the bottom there, where actually through the C40 cities network, they were actually able to speed up the delivery of electric buses by more than 5 years by like big cities pooling resources together. And and similarly in Melbourne, the city was able to have a long-term contract out to 10 years that could finance the construction of a wind farm. And so just examples of how you can create your own networks with the goal to be in line with your purpose. Finally, governance. There's millions of different forms of governance, but the key being is how do decisions get made, and how can we align that with the goals of the donut? What are the metrics? And then we're getting deeper and deeper when we start getting into the ownership, as I mentioned, like the ownership of the land and of the housing. You can talk about the utilities. Are they collectively owned, or are they owned by the multinational corporation based in Dublin or based in the Bahamas or wherever? You can talk about the data, who owns the data, and as well, who owns the businesses? Like, is it a local mom and pop shop, or is it these massive multinational brands? And finally, at the very, very deepest, related to who owns things, is of course, how are things financed? And if you're looking at a city level, you can talk about city revenue. A lot of the times, where if we want to get cars off the road, then that actually has implications for city revenue. So we need to recognize that. Do we have giant banks with hedge fund managers, or a community credit union? Is it, if you think of the city itself, what types of investments or divestments are associated with its pensions and its other pieces? So this is a tool that we think about particularly for business, but increasingly for cities and virtually all institutions, is recognizing these 5 design traits. And almost at the top is like where the purpose is, and the bottom, at the deepest level, is the finance. And in between is almost mediating whether or not finance is in service to the purpose, or whether the city is in service to finance.
Yeah, I love all that, and they're all. It's good to sort of start with that North Star and then reverse engineering how we get there. But within the governance standpoint, and I want to just dive into this for a second, really quick here, is the concept of metrics and setting goals of what success looks like. And when you hear that, what does that mean to you? Of what does success look like? And on the flip side, I also can think about, well, what does success not look like? I think not look like is the world that we know it is disappears, and we have all these different challenges, from the ocean acidification and mass population, mass famine, all these unfortunate doomsday theory thoughts, which are I don't like to think about, but I know they're a reality. But so I guess what failure looks like maybe is one thing. Maybe I'm assuming what that would look like, but what does success look like when you think about this, and in terms of how you can go about goal setting and having metrics that can be used to determine if you're making progress or not?
Yeah, that's a very deep and millennia old question, of
Yeah.
course. But no, to me at least, yeah, like success, well-being, thriving, whatever you want to call it, it's a it's a concept that is, to me, just fundamentally plural. Like, it can't be reduced to one single metric. So I really, really enjoy the donut because it keeps that plurality of dimensions. Like, we can't trade food for social equity. They're just not, they don't, they're each equally important in and of their own right. And so just recognizing that they're plural, but as well that I don't believe that we have unlimited wants, that I think that we have, limited, our needs and our wants can be sated. We can have enough. We can have a sufficient level that's not minimalist. It's not hair shirts. There's not, like sacrificing. It's just enough. And I really enjoy the concept of the donut because it embodies that idea of enough. And so I believe that really its success looks like being healthy, having, not useful, having rich relationships, having meaningful activities and pursuits and job, whether that's income-based job or a non-income related job. So it's many, many things that have been deliberated over, as I said, over millennia.
Yeah.
But I find that the practice of recognizing where we are relative to where we want to be and thinking about in terms of, you know, particular pieces, for example, these purpose, networks, governance, ownership, which side is more aligned with that vision than others, I find is helpful, because if not, it just becomes too big.
Mhm.
And I find it easier to say, okay, well, this network, we could look at this little node within it and say, okay, well, that's bad. Maybe we can move it or something along those lines. So uh, not a great answer, but
No,
a
well
millennia
said.
old question.
I mean, I think about it trying to be keep it simple. Of we we all, at least I think we all, but I know for myself, I want to be healthy and I want to be happy, and try and keep it granular like that. And a lot of these other things that we build on top of our brains, or these social constructs that frankly don't matter when you can strip it down to. I sometimes like to think about it, just think like a caveman or a cavewoman of like, what were their biggest fears, thoughts, and wants and needs? I mean, a lot of it's just sort of, to have a shelter, to find food, and to recreate. You kind of break it down of what are our true human wants and needs. So I think that
Mhm.
that sometimes maybe is reframing this this whole concept of what does growth look like. Some of our societal norms of post World War II growth is like consume, grow, build, grow, exploit. But I think we maybe need to continue to take a step back. And you mentioned biomimicry and aspects of indigenous practices. I think taking a look back at some of our older ancestors is a good strategy to think about how do we conceptualize growth on the individual level, at my household level, at the business I work for, the business I create level, to my city, to the national level. These frameworks we need to think about, and you've given us so many good insights and tools that I think these are all now this concept I believe is a lot more practical to something we can hopefully all practice after listening to this today, right
Well,
now.
I very much hope so. I very much hope so. I'm just thinking now that maybe if I could take one more stab at that, I would
Please.
say everything that you just said, while also recognizing, respecting the rights and wants of others to also, achieve their own needs. So something along those lines. I think we're very much in agreement. And if
Yeah.
this was helpful, then I'm ecstatic.
Yeah,
That's great.
very, very much so. Well, was there anything else in the PowerPoint, or any other kind of final thoughts? Um,
No, no, I think that that's enough for today. I have downloaded more than enough
yeah.
concepts
No,
for
I
you
my
and
my
for
brain is full, and I hope everyone listening as well. But I guess I want to give you sort of one last. I did just ask you, but if you were to kind of give one call to action, or one final thought, or like a mic drop, like what is one thing you would like to final thought or insight that you could maybe share with us today?
I think that I would invite you all to reflect on that question that I asked with the what we call the four lenses. So how can your place be a home to thriving people in a thriving place, while respecting the health, while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet. And I think that once you start to grapple with that question and the paradigm shift that it entails, then that's a great first step.
Andrew, so well said. And just to kind of circle it back up to, for more information about Doughnut Economics Action Lab and some resources, I'll put them in the links. But just could you tell us where would be the best places to find more of the resources and information around your work and Kate's work?
Definitely, doughnuteconomics.org. So that's the website of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. On it, you can find tools, you can find stories, you can find events, you can find news, you can join the community, discover the community of practitioners that we are aiming to build. We're not trying to become a movement. What we are encouraging is people to use the tools and integrate them into wherever they're working and whatever they're doing, because we want to join the movement, and hopefully these tools can create the the urgent action that is needed. So please check out doughnuteconomics.org and join the community if you'd like.
Andrew, you're an absolute rock star, and I really appreciate your time today and everything that you and the whole team, and especially Kate, has done for society. And um, I can't wait to talk again soon.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And I can't wait to see the next steps, what's coming out of DePaul.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew.
All right.